In 1717, the Spanish crown tried to seize control of Cuba's tobacco. Farmers resisted. Smugglers moved leaf through hidden ports. Officials fixed prices, guarded warehouses, and treated a plant like royal property. This was not yet the cigar of presidents, generals, and tycoons. It was a colonial commodity surrounded by monopoly, punishment, and fear. The leaf looked small. The system built around it was not. Over the next 2 centuries, tobacco from Cuba would be taxed, branded, politicized, mechanized, and forbidden. It would be sealed in cedar boxes, stamped with crowns, and placed in the hands of men who wanted the room to know they had arrived. But every symbol of power depends on what stays outside the frame. Behind the cigar were indigenous practices stripped of their original meaning, growers trapped inside controlled markets, enslaved and wage laborers, and skilled rollers whose hands created luxury for people they would never meet. So how did a contested colonial leaf become a sign that one man had money, time, and authority? And who had to disappear before the smoke could mean power? The deal is already finished when the cigar appears. Contracts have been signed. Glasses have been poured. The room has relaxed, but only slightly. At the head of the table, one man removes a cigar from its wooden box and turns it between his fingers. He studies the wrapper, clips the cap, and waits for the flame. No one asks him to hurry. That is part of the performance. A cigar is not built for speed. Unlike a cigarette, it is rarely consumed in a few stolen minutes beside a doorway or during a short break. It demands preparation. It occupies the hand. It changes the smell of the room. It can last through a negotiation, a celebration, or a long silence in which everyone else must remain present. The object itself is more complicated than it first appears. Inside the outer wrapper are binder leaves and a filler made from other tobacco leaves, selected for strength, aroma, combustion, and texture. A well-made cigar is designed to burn slowly and evenly. Every layer has been grown, cured, fermented, sorted, and assembled before the smoker ever sees it. Yet the final ritual makes all that labor look effortless. The polished box suggests inheritance. The band suggests pedigree. Words like reserve, vintage, handmade, and aged suggest that the object has waited patiently for the right owner. By the time the cigar reaches a private club, a political office, or the back room of a restaurant, it no longer looks like an agricultural product. It looks like authority. That image has appeared beside generals, revolutionaries, industrialists, entertainers, and elected leaders. It has been used to suggest confidence, masculinity, defiance, appetite, and command. The man holding the cigar seems to own more than the object. He seems to own the pace of the moment. But that meaning had to be constructed. First, a crown had to claim the leaf. Then generations of workers had to turn uneven plants into something precise. Finally, the finished cigar had to arrive with almost everyone behind it removed from view. To find the beginning of that transformation, we have to leave the boardroom behind. We have to return to a Caribbean shore before tobacco belonged to a crown, a company, or a brand. Long before a cigar rested in a cedar box, tobacco belonged to worlds that Europe did not yet understand. Across the Caribbean and the Americas, indigenous communities cultivated and used the plant in ways that could be social, medicinal, diplomatic, or sacred. Smoke might accompany ceremony. Leaves might be exchanged as gifts. Tobacco carried meanings rooted in particular communities, not in luxury shops or private clubs. Then, in 1492, unfamiliar sails appeared off Cuba. Members of Christopher Columbus's expedition came ashore expecting to find the markets of Asia. Instead, they encountered people using dried tobacco and drawing its smoke through simple devices. To the Europeans, the sight was strange enough to record, but they were observing an action without understanding the world around it. That misunderstanding became one of the first steps in tobacco's transformation. Imagine a sailor watching smoke rise in a village clearing. He can see the leaves, he can smell them, he can observe how they are prepared and used. What he cannot carry away is the full meaning of the act, the relationships, beliefs, memory, and authority that made it belong to that place. The material was easier to take than the meaning. Soon, Dried leaves crossed the Atlantic alongside reports of unfamiliar animals, foods, tools, and landscapes. In Europe, tobacco was examined as a curiosity and promoted as a possible medicine. Writers claimed it might relieve pain or treat illness. Courtiers, sailors, merchants, and physicians helped move the plant into new rooms, where its American origins could be acknowledged while the people who had cultivated its uses became increasingly abstract. This was not yet the modern cigar. European tobacco consumption took several forms, and the rolled leaves observed in the Americas should not be treated as an identical version of the standardized product that later emerged from Havana workshops and factories. But the essential reversal had already begun. A plant embedded in indigenous life was being detached from place. Its value would no longer depend only on what it meant to the people using it. It would depend on whether it could survive a voyage, attract buyers, satisfy courts, and generate revenue. Inside the ship's hold, tobacco became something new, portable. Once it could move, it could be copied. Once it could be sold, it could be taxed. And once it produced revenue, powerful institutions would no longer be satisfied merely to trade it. They would try to own its path from the field to the flame. Then the Crown made a different decision. If tobacco could produce revenue, Spain would not leave its movement to farmers, merchants, or smugglers. In 1717, the colonial government established a tobacco monopoly in Cuba. The Crown placed itself between the grower and the market, creating an official structure to purchase, regulate, and export the island's leaf. Tobacco could still be planted in Cuban soil, but the people who raised it would no longer decide freely where it went or what terms they would receive. For the vaqueros, the tobacco farmers around Havana, this was not an abstract change in imperial policy. Picture a grower arriving with bundles of cured leaf. He has watched the plants through heat, rain, insects, and disease. He knows which leaves are strong, which are damaged, and which might earn the best price. But at the purchasing station, another man holds the ledger, another man represents the buyer. And the buyer now speaks with the authority of the Crown. The grower can recognize every leaf. He cannot command its value. If the official buyer rejected part of the crop, offered too little, or delayed the transaction, months of work could remain stacked inside a curing house with nowhere legal to go. At first, the vaqueros challenged the monopoly through petitions and legal pressure. When those methods failed, resistance hardened. Houses and tobacco fields were burned. Confrontations spread through the countryside around Havana. The dispute lasted 6 years, ending in 1723 with a violent repression that showed how far the colonial government was prepared to go to defend its claim over the crop. The monopoly never achieved perfect control. When official buyers paid poorly or failed to absorb the harvest on acceptable terms, tobacco slipped into illegal channels. At night, a small boat could leave an unguarded shore carrying bales toward a merchant willing to pay more. Contraband was not merely criminal opportunism. It was evidence that the Crown's own rules had made evasion part of the trade. Even officials could look away or participate. And the people resisting the monopoly were not one simple class. Some growers were small farmers, others were Spanish-born entrepreneurs defending substantial commercial interests. Enslaved people and free people of color also cultivated tobacco. The field contained different degrees of wealth and freedom, but the royal bureaucracy tried to place all of them beneath the same commercial gate. That was tobacco's next transformation. The plant had crossed the Atlantic as a portable curiosity. Now it was being converted into bureaucracy. Warehouses, purchasing offices, ledgers, permits, patrols, and punishments. The Crown wanted more than a tax collected at the edge of the trade. It wanted a bureaucracy capable of reaching into the field itself. The cigar had not yet become the possession of a powerful man, but the leaf was already teaching empires how power could be extracted from smoke. The monopoly was eventually dismantled, but it had already taught tobacco another important lesson. Value could be created by controlling the story around the leaf. Spain abolished Cuba's royal tobacco monopoly in 1817. Private manufacturers gained more room to buy, roll, and sell. Workshops multiplied. Merchants looked beyond the island, and as cigar smoking became increasingly fashionable during the 19th century, Havana acquired a value that could travel farther than the tobacco itself. A cigar made from Cuban leaf was not sold merely as smoke, it was sold as Havana. That name compressed an entire production process into a single promise: particular soil, careful curing, fermentation, sorting, blending, and the judgment of skilled hands. Buyers far from Cuba could not inspect the field or question the roller. They needed other signals. The box became one of them. In a printing shop, sheets of color were prepared for wooden lids. Crowns, coats of arms, ships, tropical landscapes, elegant women, military officers, and famous men appeared inside elaborate frames. The image offered a clean world of prestige. No insects damaged its leaves. No worker bent over its table. No warehouse smelled of fermentation. The product arrived already surrounded by ceremony. Decorative bands may have been attached to individual cigars in Cuba as early as the 1830s. The narrow strip of printed paper did almost nothing to improve the tobacco. Its work was performed in the imagination. It gave the cigar a name, a lineage, and a visible claim to distinction before the buyer ever tasted it. That claim soon became political. During the United States presidential election of 1860, cigar box labels carried portraits of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas. Imagine a customer standing before two boxes in a tobacco shop. One bears the face of honest old Abe. Another displays his opponent. The choice of smoke can now announce a political loyalty. The cigar had become a small public stage. This was the decisive turn. The manufacturer no longer needed to sell only the quality of the leaf. He could sell the identity of the smoker. A crown suggested refinement. A general suggested command. A candidate suggested citizenship and allegiance. Havana suggested that the object had come from the one place believed capable of making it properly. Branding did not conceal the cigar. It concealed the conditions around it. By the time the lid opened in a hotel, club, or private office, the agricultural commodity had disappeared beneath a performance of pedigree. The cigar had become more than tobacco before it was even lit. But the performance still depended on skilled workers. And when many of those workers left Cuba for Florida, they carried more than technique with them. They carried a factory culture capable of speaking back. The cigar factory did something its owners had not intended. It placed hundreds of skilled workers in the same room and gave them something to listen to. In the 1880s, Cuban cigar manufacturers and workers moved through Key West toward Tampa, carrying leaf, tools, commercial connections, and a craft that machines could not yet easily reproduce. Vicente Martinez Ybor and Ignacio Haya helped establish a new manufacturing town near Tampa in 1885. Within a few years, brick factories, wooden workers' houses, shops, newspapers, theaters, and mutual aid societies had risen from what had been undeveloped land. The place became Ybor City. On an upper factory floor, a roller sat before a wooden board with tobacco spread across it. The filler had to be arranged so the cigar would draw properly. The binder had to hold its shape. The wrapper had to be cut with a curved chaviter, then rolled smoothly enough to conceal the seam. Length mattered, density mattered, circumference mattered. Ybor City's workers eventually produced cigars by hand in 36 shapes and sizes. The most expensive products depended on judgment that could not be reduced to one repeated motion. A damaged wrapper, a tight drawer, or an uneven body could lower the value of the finished cigar. But the workers did not leave their minds at the factory door. Above the rows of tables stood a raised platform. On it sat the lector. The reader was not hired by the owner. The workers chose and paid the lector, each contributing a small weekly amount. In the morning, the lector might unfold newspapers and read reports from Cuba, Spain, or the United States. Later, the reader could open a novel, an essay, or a political work selected by the people below. The voice moved while their hands kept working. A photograph taken by Louis Hine in a Tampa cigar factory in January 1909 preserves the arrangement. The lector elevated above the shop floor, reading books and newspapers to workers who could not stop rolling to read for themselves. The system turned paid labor time into something the owners could not completely possess. Workers heard about wars, elections, strikes, revolutions, and arguments over how society should be organized. They formed clubs, mutual aid associations, newspapers, and unions. Some manufacturers came to blame lectores for the political confidence of the workforce. One of the people shaped by this wider culture was Luisa Capetillo, a former lecturer, journalist, feminist, and labor organizer from Puerto Rico. She arrived in Ybor City in 1913. There, she organized cigar workers from Spanish, Cuban, Italian, and African American communities. Imagine her entering a room divided by language, race, occupation, and pay. The workers did not share equal positions in the industry, but they shared the sound of blades crossing boards, leaves being folded, and arguments spoken aloud above the tables. That was the contradiction at the center of the factory. Every day, workers produced an object that would later represent the independence of a wealthy man. Yet the process of producing it brought workers together, trained their attention, and gave them a public voice. The cigar factory did not merely manufacture a symbol of power. For a time, it manufactured opposition to power. The machine did not enter the cigar factory quietly. It arrived with a promise: more cigars, lower costs, fewer delays, and less dependence on the judgment of skilled rollers. For generations, the quality of a cigar had rested in the worker's fingers. A roller could feel whether the filler was too tight, whether the binder would hold, and whether the wrapper would split before the cigar reached the box. That skill gave experienced workers leverage. A factory owner could own the building and the leaf, but he still needed people who knew how to transform one into the other. Mechanization began to change that balance. Imagine a roller placing a wrapper on the board and raising the curved chavita. Beside him, a machine repeats a narrower set of motions again and again. Its products may not carry the same prestige as the finest hand-rolled cigars, but the machine does not pause for a newspaper, argue over wages, or join a strike. It also changes who can be hired. Automatic cigar-making equipment allowed factories to hire lower-paid machine operators, many of them women. Mechanization did not erase labor. It reorganized labor around the machine, lowering the value of some established skills while creating a workforce that owners believed would be easier to manage. At the same time, cigarettes were remaking tobacco consumption. They were smaller, faster, easier to carry, and suited to short breaks, mass advertising, and standardized production. The cigar had once represented modern success. Now, part of the market was moving toward a product designed for speed. Tampa's cigar production reached its height in the 1920s. Then the Great Depression, competition from cigarettes, and mechanization struck the city together. Large factories installed machines or closed. Hand production survived on a smaller scale. Workers who could no longer find a place at the tables began leaving Ybor City. The voice above those tables was also disappearing. After a major strike in 1920, some manufacturers refused to allow lectores back into their factories. By 1931, the readers had been driven from Tampa's major cigar factories. The platform that had carried newspapers, novels, and political arguments now stood empty. The silence was useful. A machine did not need to understand the words being read. An operator did not need the same years of apprenticeship as a master roller. The factory could produce more uniform objects while weakening the culture that had allowed workers to recognize themselves as a political community. Yet, mechanization produced another reversal. It did not destroy the prestige of handwork. It made handwork scarce enough to become a luxury claim. The market split. Machines supplied volume. Premium brands sold patience, individual judgment, and the visible touch of the worker whose economic power the machine had helped reduce. The skilled hand returned to the advertisement. The worker attached to it did not. Cigar smoke acquired a new meaning when Cuba became a battlefield of the Cold War. The Revolution of 1959 did more than replace a government. It reordered property, trade, and the relationship between the island and the United States. Cuban factories and brands became entangled in nationalization, exile, and competing claims over what counted as an authentic Cuban cigar. Then access itself became political. In 1960, the United States imported about $27 million worth of Cuban tobacco, including roughly $5 million in high-quality cigars. American officials warned that comparable cigars would be difficult to obtain elsewhere. 2 years later, President John F. Kennedy proclaimed an embargo on trade with Cuba. Beginning on the 7th of February 1962, goods of Cuban origin could no longer be legally imported into the United States without an authorized exception. Imagine a tobacconist counting the boxes that remain on his shelf while a radio announces the new restrictions. Yesterday, the Havana name promised quality. Now it also carries the attraction of something inaccessible. The embargo did not create the reputation of Cuban cigars. That reputation was already generations old. But scarcity and prohibition added another layer to the product. Secrecy, political meaning, and the appeal of possessing what others could not easily obtain. Cigar production continued beyond Cuba. Exiled growers, rollers, and manufacturers carried knowledge, brand names, commercial relationships, and sometimes seeds into other countries. Competing products could claim Cuban ancestry without being made on Cuban soil. The cigar's identity became divided among geography, technique, memory, and law. That struggle continues inside the word premium. On the 15th of April 2026, a federal district court reaffirmed an 8-part definition of premium cigars in litigation involving FDA user fees. The category covered hand-rolled cigars made with whole leaf wrappers, leaf binders, substantial long filler tobacco, no filters, no characterizing flavors beyond tobacco, and tightly limited ingredients. Those rules described construction and regulatory treatment. They did not certify safety. A customer in a modern cigar shop may see words such as aged, reserve, handmade, and limited. The vocabulary directs attention toward patience, pedigree, and craft. It does not describe what happens after the flame reaches the wrapper. Premium cigar smoke still contains nicotine, carbon monoxide, cancer-causing chemicals, and other harmful compounds. Risk varies with frequency, duration, inhalation, and patterns of use. But a cigar is not made harmless by being expensive, handmade, or smoked less often. That is the final transformation. A royal monopoly once decided which leaves could move. An embargo later decided which boxes could cross a border. Today, courts, regulators, and marketers debate which cigars belong inside a protected category. The authorities have changed. The cigar is still surrounded by people deciding what its name should allow us to see. The meeting is ending now. The glasses are nearly empty. The contracts have been gathered. At the head of the table, the cigar has burned down to a short cylinder of ash, held together by a wrapper that will soon collapse. The man who lit it still appears to own the room, but the cigar no longer tells only his story. Inside its smoke is a Caribbean plant, once used within worlds Europe did not understand. There is a ship carrying dried leaves across the Atlantic, a royal official opening a ledger in 1717, a farmer watching another man decide the value of his harvest. There is a printer placing crowns, generals, and presidential candidates on a wooden box. There is a roller guiding a curved blade across a wrapper leaf. A lector is reading above the factory floor, while hundreds of hands continue moving below. Then the voice disappears. A machine fills the silence. A radio announces that Cuban goods can no longer cross into the United States. Years later, a customer studies words such as handmade, aged, reserve, and premium beneath the controlled lighting of a modern shop. Every age placed a different command around the cigar. The crown commanded the trade. The manufacturer commanded the image. The factory commanded the worker's time. The embargo commanded the border. The brand commands the meaning. And yet the cigar still appears to represent independence. That may be its most successful illusion. The person holding it seems unhurried, self-made, and answerable to no one. But the object in his hand is the result of fields, laws, migrations, workshops, machines, and political decisions made across centuries. Its power never came from tobacco alone. It came from making all that history disappear behind one visible man and one rising column of smoke. The cigar is placed in the ashtray. The wrapper breaks. For a moment, the ash keeps the shape of the object it used to be. Then it falls apart. And what remains is not simply the symbol of power, but the trace of every hand that power pushed outside the frame.